without further delay, we move to the next topic on research effectiveness. I will introduce Chris Chinn, who is the coordinator of this topic, the topic writer. He's a vice president and head of health investment evidence European pharmaceutical at GlaxoSmithKline. He has first graduated from Oxford with a degree in biochemistry in 1989. Then he moved to Ernst Young in London in 1992 and joined the finance later department at SmithKline and Bisham, a global group. He completed a master in health economics at City University London, and later on joined SmithKline Bisham Health Economic Groups. Further, he moved to Eli Lilly and is now with Glaxo. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. The title of the call that we're going to talk to you about today is Incorporating Relative Effectiveness Research into Development Strategies, which is slightly different to what was on the main agenda for the forum. This is specifically looking at the comparative effectiveness of one drug, a new drug, against existing care when medicines are launched, and is extremely important in assessing the value of a new medicine to its use in a healthcare system. And it's a particular focus of the health technology assessment and reimbursement agencies across Europe, and increasing interest in agencies in other across the world. The reason we feel, as an FPA group of companies, and we have 12 companies who are willing to put resources into this call. GSK is the lead, Sanofi as co-lead, and 10 other companies. The reason we feel that this across the industry is so important to have a public-private collaboration is because of the interdependency between the pharmaceutical R&D organizations and the healthcare system and public sector in many forms. So the relationship between pharma and R&D and regulatory and HTA bodies, for example, is that we would seek advice and we follow regulation when we're devising our development strategies. We provide evidence which is reviewed by a number of stakeholders, not just the regulatory and HTA, other healthcare decision makers, but also is of vital importance to patient groups. It will affect what medicines are available to patients. And is of interest and sparks off a wave of academic research when new medicines are introduced into healthcare. But there's a sort of an iteration of providing evidence to the public sector, to healthcare decision makers, having questions and issues come back, and a cycle of developing more evidence. The point that we're going to focus on, hopefully in the call, is where that interdependency is greatest, which is at the initial assessments of medicines, for the benefit risk and for the value of introduction of a new medicine. And that is at the initial assessment because pharma R&D are the providers of the evidence of new drugs. There is no other way for public sector to generate evidence. But pharma is dependent on the insight and the decision-making of the public sector. So there is the closest and maximum interdependency at this stage. Both sides, both R&D and the public sector, are also facing a number of uncertainties and pressures which are coming to a point at this time and would lead us to want to tackle this problem collaboratively through IMI. So on the R&D side, we have R&D groups having to make very complex decisions about where to invest research resources into new drug development. They have to balance Europe and US and other worldwide evidence needs. There's a global plan. And they have to handle the uncertainty inherent in research. On top of that, now we have the uncertainty of the value of information of different studies to different stakeholders. So there's an inherent uncertainty whether investment in different trials will be received and welcomed by different HTA bodies across Europe. So there is an uncertainty when asking R&D to invest in new types of trials as to how well that data will be received and what impact it will have on access to medicines. On the public side, as well as the same acute economic pressures that we're all facing, there is uncertainty as to how to introduce new medicines into healthcare systems, where is the most value, and increasingly an understanding that there's an uncertainty even in the initial benefit-risk assessment as drugs are used in different ways or used more broadly in clinical practice. The evidence generation is seen as a continuum, and this is just a small section of the continuum of evidence generation on the life cycle of a drug. There is a lot of work that's done prior to the phase 3 registration studies, and there's a lot of work that is done after the launch of a new molecule in actual clinical practice. As I said, what we've considered as an FPA group of companies is that the work you might do on real-world evidence and relative effectiveness before phase 3, the work you might do on the current standards of care, is not necessarily pre-competitive. It is not necessarily interdependent. Each industry, each company can choose how and when to invest in real-world evidence of current standard of care. And likewise, the public sector can choose when and how to invest in research of medicines after they are launched and being widely used across Europe. But at this point where we're going from the 3A registration studies through to the initial phase 4 commitments, there is this maximum interdependency. We typically see this process as the 3A studies going in for registration, there'd be a marketing authorization followed by a reimbursement review, and that would be when your phase 4 studies would kick off your safety studies, the new PAES efficacy studies, and the major effort in comparative effectiveness research or relative effectiveness research, triggering a series of regulatory and reimbursement reviews over time. We could look at just improving the 3A studies for the value of its information to reimbursement, but we also typically would start 3B studies, not for registration, but to inform a reimbursement step slightly later, or even 3B studies which would inform an early licensing review as well as an early access review. But increasingly, we know that there are also initiatives looking at conditional licensing, which would be dependent on their success for a conditional reimbursement, but which would trigger a new opportunity to do phase 4 research earlier, leading into those regulatory and reimbursement reviews. So this just adds some complexity to the decision-making process for R&D. Which of these strategies is going to be the optimal for any given molecule in development? So the objectives of the full project, the overall objective is that we want to, as a company, we want to improve the quality of information that's available to inform these decision-making that is made at critical points in the assessment of medicines. And as I said, at launch, that initial assessment is the most interdependent. We want to then guide how and when relative effectiveness research can be incorporated into R&D drug development programs. When would it be optimal to do a phase 3A study differently? When would it be best to start a phase 3B study? And when would it be best to wait until phase 4? Ultimately, we want to increase the confidence that the HTA bodies and other decision makers have when they're assessing the value of new medicine from a sort of reimbursement and access position. And we want to, as industry companies, we want to improve the consistency of decisions that are made because they're being made on better information. And that would improve the consistency of access for patients to new medicines, and it would be a factor in improving the certainty, reducing uncertainty in decision-making back in the R&D process. We'd like the project to be able to pull together insights from related initiatives, both in Europe and the US, on comparative effectiveness research, regulatory process, clinical study design, comparative effectiveness research in the US especially. And we would hope that the outputs from this call would provide a scientific platform for other initiatives. So there would be a scientific basis by which joint scientific advice or multi-stakeholder advice could be given.